Good evening. It is nice to see so many people in here. I can't really see you, but I know you're there. Welcome to this Candlelight service, a time of singing candles and reading stories. Before we start, I'm going to need an assistant for this. Yeah, you're the assistant. Can you do what I asked you to do earlier? Thank you. They're at the back, yeah. Okay, so if you didn't pick one up, there are candles, and my wife, Amanda, is going to bring the... All right, never mind. I'm sorry, there's no more candles. If you have a candle, we're not going to use it until the very end of the service, so you can set it down. But just a safety note about the candles, they all have this piece of tin foil on the bottom of them. And that's so that when you're holding your candle and the wax drips, it doesn't drip on you and you don't drop the candle. So that's what it's there for. So don't take it off, just leave it there, and then you can, if you're like me when I was doing this when I was younger, you'll probably play with the foil the entire time, and that's fine. But that's for later. That's for almost at the end of the service. We're going to do a lot of singing tonight, and so we're going to break it up a little bit with stories. I don't know why we do this, but throughout the rest of the year, we sing a little bit, and then at Christmas, we sing a lot. And so if you find yourself losing your voice in the middle of the service, feel free to take a few verses off as we go through. But I think that's all I have. So I'd invite you to stand if that's more comfortable for your singing. We're going to sing a few songs to start. you can sit down. So we're going to hear 3 stories tonight. The first one is a silly story. The second one is kind of a sentimental story. And then the third one is the Christmas story. But we're going to start with the silly story. This is a story which is called Finding Christmas by the Canadian author Robert Munsch. All right. Julie always found her Christmas presents. One year, she found them in the basement. One year, she found them in the bathroom. One year, she found them in the garage. But this Christmas, Julie began to wonder if she was getting any presents from her family at all. She had looked and looked and looked and looked and found nothing. On Christmas Eve, Julie decided to give it one last try. She went down into the basement and pushed her way through the spider webs. No presents. She went into the bathroom and pulled out all the towels. No presents. She went into her parents' bedroom and took all the clothes out of all the drawers and all the clothes out of all the closets. No presents. She moved everything out of the garage and looked underneath the car and behind the lawnmower. No presents. She called her friend who lived across the street and said, Denise, I have looked all over the house. There is nothing here. It is Christmas Eve, and there are no presents. None at all? No presents. Denise said, Stop. I am looking over at your house, and guess what I see on the roof? I know, said Julie. There is a Santa Claus with a sleigh. My mom and dad put that up this year. Isn't it neat? Yes, it is neat, said Denise. And what is in the back of the sleigh on top of your roof? A large box, said Julie. Yes, said Denise. And what do you think is in the box? Of course, said Julie. They hid the presents on the roof. So Julie went to bed early, and then very quietly, she climbed up onto the roof. She opened the top of the box and looked in. The box was full of presents. Julie pulled herself up and fell in. The top closed, and she could not get out. She yelled, Denise! But Denise had already gone to bed. Julie yelled, Daddy! But her dad was busy decorating the tree. She yelled, Mommy! But her mom was busy wrapping one last Christmas present for her dad. She yelled, Andrew! But her brother was putting out a plate of cookies for Santa. Julie even yelled, Tia! But her sister had gone to sleep on the couch. There was no way to get out, so Julie decided to take a nap. She lay down in the middle of the presents, wrapped herself in a blanket, and went to sleep. Very late that night, Julie's mom and dad went up onto the roof and got the box and took it inside. Ha, said Julie's dad. Julie never saw any Christmas presents this time. She doesn't know what she's getting. Yes, said her mom. We definitely fooled her this time. They reached in the box and brought out a bicycle. A great present for Andrew, said Julie's dad. They reached in the box and brought out some markers. A great present for Julie, said her mom. They reached in the box and brought out some building blocks. A great present for Tia, said her dad. Then they reached in the box and brought out Julie, fast asleep. Look at this, said Julie's dad. It's a little girl. Who's getting a little girl? I didn't get anyone a little girl, said Julie's mom. Well, it looks like a really nice little girl, and I want it for my Christmas present, said her dad. It looks like a really nice little girl to me, too, and I want it for my Christmas present, said her mom. No, said her dad, I saw it first, and it's going to be my present. No, said her mom, it's a girl, and I'm a girl, so it should belong to me. Then Julie woke up. Wait a minute, she said. I belong to you both. Right, said her mom and dad. Then they gave her kisses and hugs and wrapped her up and put her under the Christmas tree with a label that said, to Mommy and Daddy. On Christmas morning, Andrew and Tia found Julie all wrapped up under the tree. So Andrew wrapped himself up and went under the tree. And Tia wrapped herself up and went under the tree. When their parents finally woke up, the kids all yelled, Merry Christmas! And everyone agreed that it was the best Christmas ever. The end. All right, I'm going to invite you to rise again, if you please. We're going to sing 2 more songs. You can sit down again. So the next story we're going to read is the sentimental story. If you were the kind of person who liked to ruin parties, you might call it a kind of a schmaltzy story. But sometimes schmaltzy is good at Christmas. This is also a little bit long, and so if you're a person who gets antsy or you need to get up in the middle of it, I won't be offended if you need to get up while I'm reading. It is called Christmas at Red Butte, and it's by Lucy Maud Montgomery, who also wrote the Anne of Green Gables books. Of course, Santa Claus will come, said Jimmy Martin confidently. Jimmy was 10, and at 10, it is easy to be confident. Why, he's got to come, because it is Christmas Eve, and he always has come. You know that, twins. Yes, the twins knew it, and cheered by Jimmy's superior wisdom, their doubts passed away. There had been one terrible moment when Theodora had sighed and told them they mustn't be too much disappointed if Santa Claus didn't come this year, because the crops had been poor, and he mightn't have had enough presents to go around. That doesn't make any difference to Santa Claus, scoffed Jimmy. You know as well as I do, Theodora Prentice, that Santa Claus is rich whether the crops fail or not. They failed 3 years ago before Father died, but Santa Claus came all the same. Probably you don't remember it, twins, because you were too little, but I do. Of course he'll come, so don't you worry a mite. And he'll bring my skates and your dolls. He knows we're expecting them, Theodora, because we wrote him a letter last week and threw it up the chimney. And there'll be candy and nuts, of course, and Mother's gone to town to buy a turkey. I tell you, we're going to have a ripping Christmas. Well, don't use such slangy words about it, Jimmy boy, sighed Theodora. She couldn't bear to dampen their hopes any further, and perhaps Aunt Elizabeth might manage if the colt sold well, but Theodora had her painful doubts, and she sighed again as she looked out of the window far down the trail that wound across the prairie, red-lighted by the declining sun of the short, wintry afternoon. Do people always sigh like that when they get to be 16? Asked Jimmy curiously. You didn't sigh like that when you were only 15, Theodora. I wish you wouldn't. It makes me feel funny, and it's not a nice kind of funniness either. It's a bad habit I've gotten into lately, said Theodora, trying to laugh. Old folks are dull sometime, you know, Jimmy boy. 16 is awful old, isn't it? Said Jimmy reflectively. I'll tell you what I'm going to do when I'm 16, Theodora. I'm going to pay off the mortgage and buy Mother a silk dress and a piano for the twins. Won't that be elegant? I'll be able to do that because I'm a man. Of course, if I was only a girl, I couldn't. I hope you'll be a good, kind, brave man and a real help to your mother, said Theodora softly, sitting down before the cozy fire and lifting the fat little twins into her lap. Oh, I'll be good to her, never you fear, assured Jimmy, squatting comfortably down on the little fur rug before the stove, the skin of the coyote his father had killed 4 years ago. I believe in being good to your mother when you've only got the one. Now, tell us a story, Theodora, a real jolly story, you know, with lots of fighting in it. Only, please don't kill anybody. I like to hear about fighting, but I like to have all the people come out alive. Theodora laughed and began a story about the Riel Rebellion of 85. That's 1885. A story which had the double merit of being true and exciting at the same time. It was quite dark when she finished, and the twins were nodding, but Jimmy's eyes were wide open and sparkling. That was great, he said, drawing a long breath. Tell us another. No, it's bedtime for you all, said Theodora firmly. One story at a time is my rule, you know. But I want to sit up till Mother comes home, objected Jimmy. You can't. She may be very late, for she would have to wait to see Mr. Porter. Besides, you don't know what time Santa Claus might come, if he comes at all. If he were to drive along and see you children up, instead of being sound asleep in bed, he might go right on and never call at all. This argument was too much for Jimmy. All right, we'll go, but we have to hang up our stockings first. Twins, get yours. The twins toddled off in great excitement and brought back their Sunday stockings, which Jimmy proceeded to hang along the edge of the mantel shelf. This done, they all trooped obediently off to bed. Theodora gave another sigh and seated herself at the window where she could watch the moonlit prairie for Mrs. Martin's homecoming and knit at the same time. I am afraid that you will think from all the sighing Theodora was doing that she was a very melancholy and despondent young lady. You couldn't think anything was more unlike the real Theodora. She was the jolliest, bravest girl of 16 in all Saskatchewan, as her shining brown eyes and rosy dimpled cheeks would have told you. And her sighs were not on her own account, but simply for fear the children were going to be disappointed. She knew that they would be almost heartbroken if Santa Claus did not come, and that this would hurt the patient, hard-working little mother more than all else. 5 years before this, Theodora had come to live with Uncle George and Aunt Elizabeth in the little log house at Red Butte. Her own mother had just died, and Theodora had only her big brother Donald left, and Donald had Klondike fever. The Martins were poor, but they had gladly made room for their little niece, and Theodora had lived there ever since, her aunt's right-hand girl and the beloved playmate of the children. They had been very happy until Uncle George's death 2 years before this Christmas Eve, but since then there had been hard times in the little log house, and though Mrs. Martin and Theodora did their best, it was a woefully hard task to make both ends meet, especially this year when their crops had been poor. Theodora and her aunt had made every sacrifice possible for the children's sake, and at least Jimmy and the twins had not felt the pinch very severely yet. At 7, Mrs. Martin's bells jingled at the door, and Theodora flew out. "Go right in and get warm, Auntie," she said briskly. "I'll take Ned away and unharness him." "It's a bitterly cold night," said Mrs. Martin wearily. There was a note of discouragement in her voice that struck dismay to Theodora's heart. "I'm afraid it means no Christmas for the children tomorrow," she thought sadly, as she led Ned away to the stable. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Martin was sitting by the fire, her face in her chilled hand, sobbing convulsively. "Auntie, oh, Auntie, don't," exclaimed Theodora impulsively. It was such a rare thing to see her plucky, resolute little auntie in tears. "You're cold and tired. I'll have a nice cup of tea for you in a trice." "No, it isn't that," said Mrs. Martin brokenly. "It was seeing those stockings hanging there. Theodora, I couldn't get a thing for the children, not a single thing. Mr. Porter would only give $40 for the colt, and when all the bills were paid, there was barely enough left for such necessities as we must have. I suppose I ought to feel thankful I could get those, but the thought of the children's disappointment tomorrow is more than I can bear. It would have been better to have told them long ago, but I kept building on getting more for the colt. Well, it's weak and foolish to give way like this. We'd better both take a cup of tea and go to bed. It will save fuel." When Theodora went up to her little room, her face was very thoughtful. She took a small box from her table and carried it to the window. In it was a very pretty little gold locket hung on a narrow blue ribbon. Theodora held it tenderly in her fingers and looked out over the moonlit prairie with a very sober face. Could she give up her dear locket? The locket Donald had given her just before he started for the Klondike? She had never thought she could do such a thing. It was almost the only thing she had to remind her of Donald. Handsome, merry, impulsive, warm-hearted Donald, who had gone away 4 years ago with a smile on his bonny face and splendid hope in his heart. "Here's a locket for you, gift of God," he had said happily. He had such a dear, loving habit of calling her by the beautiful meaning of her name. A lump came into Theodora's throat as she remembered it. "I couldn't afford a chain, too, but when I come back, I'll bring you a rope of Klondike nuggets for it." Then he had gone away. For 2 years, letters had come from him regularly. Then he wrote that he had joined a prospecting party to a remote wilderness. After that was silence, deepening into anguish of suspense that finally ended in hopelessness. A rumor came that Donald Prentice was dead. None had returned from the expedition he had joined. Theodora had long ago given up all hope of ever seeing Donald again. Hence, her locket was doubly dear to her. But Aunt Elizabeth had always been so good and loving and kind to her. Could she not make the sacrifice for her sake? Yes, she could and would. Theodora flung up her head with a gesture that meant decision. She took out of the locket the bits of hair, her mother's and Donald's, which it contained. Perhaps a tear or two fell as she did so. Then hastily donned her warmest cap and wraps. It was only 3 miles to Spencer. She could easily walk it in an hour, and as it was Christmas Eve, the shops would be open late. She must walk, for Ned could not be taken out again, and the mare's foot was sore. Besides, Aunt Elizabeth must not know until it was done. As stealthily as if she were bound on some nefarious errand, Theodora slipped downstairs and out of the house. The next minute, she was hurrying along the trail in the moonlight. The great, dazzling prairie was around her, the mystery and splendor of the northern night all about her. It was very calm and cold, but Theodora walked so briskly that she kept warm. The trail from Red Butte to Spencer was a lonely one. Mr. Lurgan's house, halfway to town, was the only dwelling on it. When Theodora reached Spencer, she made her way at once to the only jewelry store the little town contained. Mr. Benson, its owner, had been a friend of her uncle's, and Theodora felt sure that he would buy her locket. Nevertheless, her heart beat quickly, and her breath came and went uncomfortably fast as she went in. Suppose he wouldn't buy it. Then there would be no Christmas for the children at Red Butte. "Good evening, Miss Theodora," said Mr. Benson briskly. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I'm not a very welcome sort of customer, Mr. Benson," said Theodora with an uncertain smile. "I want to sell, not buy. Will you buy this locket?" Mr. Benson pursed up his lips, took up the locket, and examined it. "Well, I don't often buy secondhand stuff," he said after some reflection. "But I don't mind obliging you, Miss Theodora. I'll give you $4 for this trinket." Theodora knew that the locket had cost a great deal more than that, but $4 would get what she wanted, and she dared not ask for more. In a few minutes, the locket was in Mr. Benson's possession, and Theodora, with 4 crisp new bills in her purse, was hurrying to the toy store. Half an hour later, she was on her way back to Red Butte with as many parcels as she could carry. Jimmy's skates, 2 lovely dolls for the twins, packages of nuts and candy, and a nice, plump turkey. Theodora beguiled her lonely tramp by picturing the children's joy in the morning. About a quarter of a mile past Mr. Lurgan's house, the trail curved suddenly about a bluff of poplars. As Theodora rounded the turn, she halted in amazement. Almost at her feet, the body of a man was lying across the road. He was clad in a big fur coat and had a fur cap pulled well down over his forehead and ears. Almost all of him that could be seen was a full, bushy beard. Theodora had no idea who he was or where he had come from, but she realized that he was unconscious and that he would speedily freeze to death if help were not brought. The footprints of a horse galloping across the prairies suggested a fall and a runaway, but Theodora did not waste time in speculation. She ran back at full speed to Mr. Lurgan's and roused the household. In a few minutes, Mr. Lurgan and his son had hitched a horse to a wood sleigh and hurried down the trail to the unfortunate man. Theodora, knowing that her assistance was not needed and that she ought to get home as quickly as possible, went on her way as soon as she had seen the stranger in safekeeping. When she reached the little log house, she crept in, cautiously put the children's gifts in their stockings, placed the turkey on the table where Aunt Elizabeth would see it the first thing in the morning, and then slipped off to bed, a weary but very happy girl. The joy that reigned in the little log house the next day more than repaid Theodora for her sacrifice. "Whoopee! Didn't I tell you that Santa Claus would come all right?" shouted the delighted Jimmy. "Oh, what splendid skates!" The twins hugged their dolls in silent rapture, but Aunt Elizabeth's face was the best of all. Then the dinner had to be prepared, and everybody had a hand in that. Just as Theodora, after a grave peep into the oven, had announced that the turkey was done, A sleigh dashed around the house. Theodora flew to answer the knock at the door, and there stood Mr. Lurgan and a big, bewhiskered, fur-coated fellow whom Theodora recognized as the stranger she had found on the trail. But was he a stranger? There was something oddly familiar in those merry brown eyes. Theodora felt herself growing dizzy. "Donald!" she gasped. "Oh, Donald!" And then she was in the big fellow's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Donald it was indeed, and then followed half an hour during which everybody talked at once, and the turkey would have been burned to a crisp had it not been for the presence of mind of Mr. Lurgan, who, being the least excited of them all, took it out of the oven and set it on the back of the stove. "To think that it was you last night and that I never dreamed it," exclaimed Theodora. "Oh, Donald, if I hadn't gone to town, I'd have frozen to death, I'm afraid," said Donald soberly. "I got into Spencer on the last train last night. I felt that I must come right out. I couldn't wait till morning, but there wasn't a team to be got for love or money. It was Christmas Eve and all the livery rigs were out. So I came on horseback. Just by that bluff, something frightened my horse, and he shied violently. I was half asleep and thinking of my little sister, and I went off like a shot. I suppose I struck my head against a tree. Anyway, I knew nothing more until I came to in Mr. Lurgan's kitchen. I wasn't much hurt, feel none the worse of it except for a sore head and shoulder, but, oh, gift of God, how you have grown. I can't realize that you were the little sister I left 4 years ago. I suppose you have been thinking I was dead?" "Yes. And, oh, Donald, where have you been?" "Well, I went way up north with a prospecting party. We had a tough time the first year, I can tell you, and some of us never came back. We weren't in a country where post offices were lying around loose either, you see. Then at last, just as we were about giving up in despair, we struck it rich. I've brought a snug little pile home with me, and things are going to luck up in this log house, gift of God. There will be no more worrying for you, dear people, over mortgages." "I'm so glad. For Auntie's sake," said Theodora with shining eyes. "But, oh, Donald, it's best of all just to have you back. I'm so perfectly happy that I don't know what to do or say." "Well, I think you might have dinner," said Jimmy in an injured tone. "The turkey's getting stone cold, and I'm most starving. I just can't stand it another minute." And so, with a laugh, they all sat down to the table and ate the merriest Christmas dinner the little log house had ever known. Since we're all cozy now, you can stay seated for the next two songs. All right, if you want to get your candles ready. Before we light the candles, I'm going to read the Christmas story. I really don't want to start a fire. So this is our last story. This is the Christmas story. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 20, and this is a slightly different version of the Bible. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby. It was night, and they were taking care of their sheep. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. They were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news. It will bring great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. Here is how you will know I am telling the truth. You will find a baby wrapped in strips of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly, a large group of angels from heaven also appeared. They were praising God. They said, "May glory be given to God in the highest heaven, and may peace be given to those he is pleased with on earth." The angels left and went into heaven. Then the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem. Let's see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby. The baby was lying in the manger. After the shepherds had seen him, they told everyone. They reported what the angel had said about this child. All who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary kept all these things like a secret treasure in her heart. She thought about them over and over. The shepherds returned. They gave glory and praise to God. Everything they had seen and heard was just as they had been told. I think we should stand because we're going to sing after we light the candles. So I'm going to go down the middle of the aisle, and you can light your candle off mine, and if you wouldn't mind sending your candle down the row. We're going to sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You can blow out your candles, and I'll talk for a few seconds so that they can cool off. And you can set your candles down. There's a tray outside the store that you can leave them on so we don't drip wax everywhere. You're also invited into the fellowship hall. We have coffee and punch and sandwiches and raisin bread, and you're welcome to stick around. But thank you very much for coming.